In 1994, Nelson Mandela became president of the Republic of South Africa. Soon the country would adopt a new constitution and even a new flag. This was the new South Africa, a democratic, multiracial state, the Rainbow Nation. White dominance was over. Right?
Welcome to Orania, South Africa's only pure white town founded by Afrikaners for Afrikaners.
Huh?
South Africa's only pure white town founded by Afrikaners for Afrikaners.
Yeah. This town's called Orania. It's a community in the Northern Cape in which only white people live. And in order to fully understand how it came about, you have to go back before South Africa's first democratic election. 3 years before, actually, in 1991. By then, the writing was on the wall. President F.W. de Klerk had announced that the ban on the African National Congress, more commonly known as the ANC, and other opposition organizations would be repealed.
The prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded.
Apartheid was on its deathbed, and some Afrikaners felt like they had a lot to lose. Once it became clear that black majority rule in South Africa was inevitable, an Afrikaner academic named Karl Boshoff took action. He, by the way, was married to the daughter of infamous South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, a cruel authoritarian leader who's often called the architect of apartheid. So basically, Boshoff had connections and access to a lot of financial support. Boshoff, like a significant number of other Afrikaners at the time, believed that in order to resist black majority rule, whites, specifically Afrikaners, needed to come together and become a majority somewhere rather than being a minority everywhere. He felt like this concept could be defended legally because one of South Africa's 34 constitutional principles explicitly states that all people of South Africa have the right to self-determination. So he and a few followers founded a town called Orania on the Orange River. A community of about 500 poor black and colored squatters had made their homes and buildings there, left behind by an abandoned construction project. Boshoff spoke to the community that existed there after the purchase, and reportedly he said he didn't buy a bus with passengers. And what followed, according to Cambridge historian Edward Kavanagh's History of Land Rights on the Orange River, was one of the last large-scale evictions under apartheid. It was carried out by the future residents of Orania. There were beatings, there were pistol whippings, attack dogs were set loose. Orania started with only 13 residents, but today they've got over 1,700. The town is growing at over 10% a year, which outpaces even South Africa's biggest cities. Now, the leaders of the community insist that anyone who wants to move to Orania can, provided that they believe in the preservation of Afrikaner cultural values.
Anyone that's willing to integrate into that, regardless of skin color, will be welcome in Orania.
And yet, not a single person of color lives or has ever lived in Orania. The town is mostly made up of Afrikaner farmers and laborers. Orania offers land and houses as incentives for people to move there. And history classes in Orania schools have a dual curriculum. There's the government-mandated lesson plan, which teaches what most people would consider to be a more accurate history of South Africa. And there's Orania's program, which presents what teachers call an Afrikaner's view of history.
It is geography and history in one book from the viewpoint of the new regime, which is also subjective. This is more from our viewpoint, so they can compare the two and they can make their own opinion.
Amazingly, Nelson Mandela, the first president of a democratic South Africa, an internationally known figure, he's not even mentioned in their history books because teachers say he's not a part of their story. Now, black and colored South Africans have no illusions about what's going on here.
It's actually sad for me to see a place like this. It's very small.
They don't want to be associated with black people. They don't want to be associated with South Africa of today. They still believe in the past.
But, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, Orania's white residents think about it a little differently. News teams visit the town all the time, so there's a huge number of video records all over the internet in which members of the community explain why they think Orania should exist. Some say they're looking for work. They're unemployed, and they claim that far too often whites are turned down simply because of their race in South Africa.
Where I'm staying, it's, to get work is so hard. And I think that's mainly because of my skin color.
Others say they're looking for safety. Around 57 people are murdered every day in South Africa, and crime in Orania is virtually non-existent.
We don't lock our cars at night here. We don't lock our house. If you look at our front door there, the key is in the front door. So you open it and you walk in whenever you want to do it.
But the vast majority of these defenses of Orania focus on one particular idea: freedom.
People here say they just want the freedom to live according to their own cultural norms.
We would like to redefine our structures in such a way that we decide on our own affairs and in that sense experience ourselves as being free, whilst at the same moment be in peace with everybody around us.
We say in Orania that Afrikaners lost their freedom. They lost their control over their own destiny.
Freedom is a big amount of responsibility for you and your own. If you don't take responsibility for your own people, then you cannot be a free people. That's Orania's biggest struggle. That's what we are aiming for as well, as a community, to be free.
A lot of Orania apologists insist that people in the town are truly free, and that's why its existence is important. But we should ask ourselves, when they say freedom, what exactly do they mean? And what can it tell us about the history of South Africa and about the way people understand themselves there? The Union of South Africa was formed in 1910. The Union, by the way, was a self-governing dominion of the British Empire. It's the historical predecessor to today's republic. Since then, there have essentially been two competing definitions of freedom in South Africa. First is the notion of freedom as it was articulated by Afrikaner nationalists. The word freedom has always been really important in the way they talk about themselves and their goals. Take, for example, this bit of a speech from D.F. Malan, South African Prime Minister from 1948 to 1954, who presided over the implementation of apartheid for the first time. It was his campaign platform. This is from 1938, when Afrikaners were celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Voortrekkers' victory over the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River. He said, "Their freedom was, above all, the freedom to preserve themselves as a white race. As you could never otherwise have realized, you realize today their task to make South Africa a white man's land is 10 times more your task." Afrikaner nationalist freedom has always meant protection from what they saw as the very real threat of extermination. They imagined that under a black majority government, they'd be wiped out, destroyed. The idea of freedom didn't diminish in its importance for Afrikaner nationalists at all as the 20th century wore on. It was something Hendrik Verwoerd, notorious South African prime minister, loved to talk about. He mentions it 7 times, for example, in his short speech celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the South African Republic in 1966. "We who have achieved this freedom," he exclaims. That's how he talks about white Afrikaner South Africans. To him, the existence of the white Afrikaner has been secured because the white Afrikaner state has been secured. The two are inseparable. For Afrikaners to be free in South Africa, Afrikaners have to dominate. There is no in-between. Now, on the other hand, those fighting apartheid, the ANC and other groups, believed in a very different kind of freedom.
The Africans want the franchise on the basis of one man, one vote. We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
At a very basic level, the freedom to vote, the freedom to own land, the freedom to move, especially. These are what you could call positive freedoms, the freedom to do something rather than freedom from something. People of color in South Africa wanted the freedom to play their music, to express their thoughts, to become something other than a laborer, to be seen, to exist on their own terms. Freedom was a fundamental concept to them, too. Nelson Mandela would eventually title his biography, Long Walk to Freedom. And every once in a while, it seemed like a small measure of this freedom had been achieved. In places like Sophiatown, for example, a suburb of Johannesburg that became a legendary hub of black culture. But the white South African government crushed places like this because, in their view, their freedom, what they saw as their freedom, was being threatened. These two freedoms were fundamentally opposed to each other. That much is obvious. The achievement of one meant the failure of the other. So, in the early 90s, the creation of a democratic South Africa and the idea of the Rainbow Nation convinced a non-negligible number of Afrikaners that their freedom was being destroyed. But as you can see, freedom to them meant dominance. It meant white majority rule. And they were right. White majority rule in South Africa was at an end. And that's why Orania was created, to revive that idea of freedom as Afrikaner nationalists defined it. Now, if you're an American watching this, you might be thinking, this is crazy. I mean, it's so different from how we talk about freedom here in America. Well, let's take a look. There were a lot of American activists in the late 20th century who very passionately and very publicly denounced apartheid. South Africa became a pariah in the international community, and we Americans often have a tendency to view apartheid as this horrific, evil thing whose cruelty had no equal anywhere in the world. And apartheid was cruel, horrific, and evil. But the rhetoric behind the apartheid system, that twisted idea of freedom that I was just talking about, isn't unique to South Africa. Take a look at this.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
That's Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who very famously stood in front of the entrance of the University of Alabama trying to stop National Guardsmen from letting black students into the university when segregation was being dismantled by the Kennedy administration. Not a figure who's looked upon well in history. But that was 58 years ago, right? I mean, what about today?
And control. We are born free, and we will stay free.
When Donald Trump says freedom, what do you think he means? Look at the people who are cheering for him. What do they look like? Whose freedom do you think he's talking about? One of my favorite classes in college was called The History of South Africa, taught by an amazing professor, Dan Magaziner, incredible lecturer, incredible. And near the end of the semester, he asked us to reflect on what we'd learned from the class. And I thought about it for a long time. There are a lot of answers to that question, probably infinite answers. But here's one of them. The history of South Africa can teach us that the idea of freedom is dangerous because, like a lot of abstract concepts, it can be easily harnessed to represent something very sinister, something that people might not like to say explicitly. But something they really believe. So next time you're reading or watching the news and you hear someone talk about freedom, pause for a second. Whose freedom do they mean? Do they really mean freedom Or do they mean the freedom of those who are in power to stay in power for good?